I'm George Eastwood of the Emily Whitehead Foundation. Excited to lead some panel discussion here, some presentations focused on supply chain risk mitigation. A lot of the learnings we've had through the last 12 years of CAR T and cell therapies being mainstream. At the foundation, putting the patient first and putting that patient connection here is something we're really passionate about, even on the supply chain side. And I think Advanced Therapies we can facilitate. That's always been a goal, and rather unique to, I guess, any other drug development system is the patient connection. Starting with Emily's cells and the 50 to 70 people that touch them at Penn. But as we expand beyond the work being done at Penn into the conference we have today, there's so many learnings and connections we can have. So great panelists here today. We'll start with a quick fireside chat with Bill. I had a chance to connect the last couple of weeks, and many parallels in the way that we've interacted and the learnings that we can share with everyone here today. And then we'll have a few panels before bringing everybody up for some questions from the audience. But I'll take a seat, chat with Bill, and then we'll move on from here. So thanks so much. Bill, thanks for taking the time here to chat around your experience. As I mentioned, we connected a couple of weeks ago. Lots of commonality in the early days of figuring out how we can deliver cell therapies and CAR T at scale. So a bit of your background to start, some of your early learnings and connections, and then go from there.
Yeah, so see some familiar faces from the previous panel. My name is Bill Beck. Right now I'm the supply chain director for BlueRock Therapeutics. Prior to that, I spent 2 years head of supply chain at Charisma. We were doing Charisma Therapeutics. We were doing some first-in-human CAR monocyte and macrophage work. And prior to that, I was at 18 years at Celgene and Bristol Myers Squibb, where we did, I was in part of manufacturing site startups in cell therapy, and then launching a Beckma and Breyanzi, and transitioned over to Charisma after that. So varied experience across a couple different pathways. And it is funny, George and I did not know him, but once we connected on LinkedIn, we had like 150 shared connections. And when our first conversation, we have history like that goes back 10 or 15 years. So very small industry. So it's always nice when you can connect with somebody and then you just sort of start riffing on. I was like, what are we going to talk about? And it's like, we can talk about anything. So we've already spent a little bit of time killing some time here. But I think overall, what we can try to maybe talk about some of the learnings that I've worked with is, I guess, if you're looking at new market models for supply, I guess one of the things that you have to sort of call out, especially in this space, is the need to be agile. So if you're looking at the traditional model, I guess the agile model would be something that you want to work with. Very rarely when we're working in the new market models do we have alignment on demand and supply. Integrated business planning is a business doing the things that it needs to do. So like aligning to being agile to adjust your plans from an integrated business planning perspective. And then also in that regard, looking at sort of your supply base and trying to find suppliers who are comfortable working in that agile space. So if you're working with maybe just one single traditional supplier who isn't familiar with the changes and the need to be agile, are they going to be able to help you and support you in your ultimate goals? They may be best in class, but are they best in class for a model that doesn't work for you? And then is that going to be a mismatch in capabilities where you end up going to be detrimental and it's not going to be fulfilling those relationships to the best ability? And then I think we can maybe go into a couple of these things just from overall risk mitigation. Patrick was talking a little bit earlier, and I think some of the common themes for the other activities and what we'll try to talk about is that risk mitigation is like looking, not like risk mitigation in the near term, like I'm going to mitigate this specific risk, but really trying to take a longer term view of your risk mitigation activities and trying to figure out how does the strategy of the organization and your mitigation outlook, is it stretching far enough out? In this space, timelines, capacity ramp, or any kind of additional capability build takes a lot longer and is a lot more complex. So that activity is going to take you longer than you expect for a multitude of reasons. And then generally the timelines end up getting constrained because we all want to go faster and better in shorter time frames. So the two of those are mismatched. And if you're not looking and trying to have risk mitigation activities that stretch that horizon so you can plan appropriately, you're not going to have time to be able to react and implement those risk mitigation strategies because your timeline is pulling forward and it's taking longer. And whatever slack that you thought you had in some of those programs and those timelines.
So you mentioned being 18 years at BMS Celgene. I'd imagine that time took you long before cell therapy.
Yeah.
So maybe what was it like at the very beginning, transitioning from whatever projects you were working on to being, I'd imagine, swept into, we're doing cell therapy now. So what did that, if you take us back to that time, what was
So
that
actually, I started off, my very first job was building a cell therapy manufacturing facility and working as a manufacturing arm. So I started in cell therapy with some adherent cell culture work. So we started there, and then I moved out of that part of the business, which was very new and nascent with raw material suppliers and healthy donor cells and all the different reagents and stuff that you're working with, and then went into a project management organization within the broader Celgene team. And then there, we were in the traditional small molecule tablet space, and things were just a little bit less, I don't want to say complex, but they were just a little bit less complex. You didn't have the integrated nature of the value chain talk that you had previously. The value chain here goes all the way from the patient, and you could do all these activities and pre-treatments, et cetera, right? The timeline for treatment goes all the way out, and you have safety stock all along the way. So your risk mitigation, some of your risk mitigations of those is built in all along the way. With the advanced therapies, you don't really have that slack. So then coming back to launch the facility and build up those products and transition to Beckman and Branzian, that's sort of where that comes into play. During that time when I wasn't in that space, you could just take a little bit longer, and your challenges were maybe a little bit more, able to handle them a little bit easier. The pressure and the space and the time and the immaturity of the cell therapy space makes that risk mitigation activities really come together pretty quickly.
So as the head of supply chain side, the beginning of that supply chain is patient material, and often discussed is that part of the manufacturing process, right? And so I guess from a supply chain perspective, it's interesting to ask as opposed to the clinical side. So waiting on material to come into your manufacturing facility, what does that look like for you as the head of supply chain? Is that something you interact with? How do you look at this variable material coming in and the complicated world that stems from?
It actually had a lot. So working there did production planning, capacity ramp, raw material readiness for the facility, running the manufacturing plant from the supply chain side with a bunch of different counterparts. But the variability in terms of the time that you have, and it goes all the way from the variability of the process, right? Do we know what our yield is going to be? Luckily, we had a fixed manufacturing process for one of our processes. So, your starting material, the higher quality you can get for some of the products has a real impact on, do you have a variable harvest time? How do you manage capacity at your facility? If there is variable, so how do you get the best possible product to start off with? So yes, it is a raw material. How do we control it the best? How do we put controls at the institutions, which is a totally new part of the industry that, again, you are learning from? How do we help the treatment centers and the apheresis centers and the patients get the best possible outcome, and then have a manufacturing slot available so that they can do it and then take advantage of that? But I think it goes then all the way back to, if you're looking at your overall capacity for your facility and how you're going to run that, if you don't get good product from the very beginning, and say you have a manufacturing defect or a cancellation, that goes back into your integrated business planning process. And how do you run your organization? Are you accounting for failures in manufacturing? Do you have a new slot that's open so this patient can get retreated right away? Do you have additional material that you can have? So something as nuanced as just, give me my starting material. Well, if it's not good enough, is that going to impact your manufacturing success rate, your turnaround targets, the interactions you have with your whole clinical team, and do you have material then to restart? So it touches multiple facets along the supply chain, and that's just for that one material. It's critical starting material, but has broad impact across the multiple pillars of your organization.
And that direct connection to the clinical side, I think, is what unique to the very early days. So we look at it as a raw material, but it is a person and a patient. How is that connection between the clinical end and supply chain manufacturing so early in CAR T? And then what has changed since through your time now at BlueRock? How is that direct connection?
So I think even now, I'd like to say we have a good connection at BlueRock, right? I think in Charisma too, we were trying to start up and start with the end in mind. So you're working with those relationships right off the bat. But I think that's part of the new market supply model where you had an interaction previously where I have biologics or small molecules that are probably pre-positioned at pharmacies or a distributor that the clinical team goes into IRT, just make sure materials at the investigator site in order to dose. Now it was a totally different operating model. So stability of supply in that respect is your end product. How are we handling that communication flow and the operations between the clinical ops team and the supply or tech ops manufacturing organization and the physician? That was just a communication pathway. That's just an operational pathway. You're not designing anything new, but it's how do these functions work together to have the best possible patient outcome. And I think in order to use your manufacturing slots that are limited, I think we have a lot of CDMOs, contract manufacturers, right? There's a need for that because we don't have enough capacity, but we also have a lot of unutilized capacity in the network as well, due to maybe misaligned planning or a slot not being available specifically when a patient needs it if you can't make that up. So, through those processes and building the right connections at the right time points and right planning fences, how do you then utilize your manufacturing capacity that you do have more efficiently and also have a better outcome for the patient? You can treat more patients. And I think that was a learning that you needed to come to because it wasn't something that was built in previously, but it had nothing to do with the product or the delivery. It was the communications, which was, probably the hardest part or one of the hardest parts.
Yeah. And you mentioned, the partners and the ecosystem and the communication. We have Sam and Phyllis, in fact, and BCA coming up later. What are some of those partnerships that are, I guess, needed and valid, and how did they begin to be developed, and
I think
how do you look at them now?
You're looking at capabilities, not only now, but in the longer term. I think when you sort of start off in an industry, some of maybe your key suppliers are, manifold sets, plastics, it goes to a whole bunch of different things. Do they have the capacity to ramp to support everybody? Like, what do you really need to look at? What is your business like to them, and trying to be the best possible partner there? And if you don't have the capacity and I'm giving somebody a forecast and I'm asking them to commit to increasing their throughput, like, am I being a good partner? Do I really know what my demand is? How do we bring, like, in this industry, in this sort of space, all tides and all ships need to rise together. So making sure that we're not too far ahead of where we need to be, we're communicating as transparently as possible, and putting the suppliers in the best position so that they can help us deliver on the mission for product delivery.
And I think, specifically here, facilitate Advanced Therapies Week, so many innovative suppliers from the plastic space to devices and other pieces that are integral. How do you work in those new technologies while looking at the old guard of your previous suppliers? So that's a struggle we've always had. How do you find the time when you're rapidly getting to the clinic or rapidly racing a competitor to market to get commercial approval?
What's your life cycle strategy? I think that goes into your risk mitigation. Do you want to go with a strategy that would be fast to launch or best in class to launch, or it's an organizational decision, but trying to find opportunities to life cycle and manage this industry now. How do you bridge to automation once you've already gone commercial? Do you implement automation in your next phase? I think that's a topic that continually goes on from the supply chain side. What are the connections we need to make from a vendor management, or talking with the research teams and making sure that we have the line of sight to what their thoughts are, and we are aligned as an organization. Because starting with the end in mind, I think, was another topic here that we've talked about a couple times, is going to help you, because it takes a long time to bridge. It takes a long time to demonstrate comparability. If you have variable products on the input, you need your analytical teams to work. I'm not a scientist, but I rely on the analytical teams to sort of draft a comparability matrix and everything else. And if you're trying to bridge to that, all that takes time and resources, and what's your priority for the organization?
Yeah. Last question. So in all of the time that people have thrown things over the fence to you, what is one of the craziest requests you've gotten, and how did you get through it?
Oh, just overall, there's a lot. There's not one. I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus that I worked with previously or not, but generally, how can you ramp faster? How fast can you ramp, right? So it's all about capacity ramp in the space previously, and it was that is
Just a generic
that's insane.
ask without guidance.
That
How
that
fast can you
timeline
move?
is that insane. How fast can you move, and when did you need it? 6 months ago is what we generally go with. So
Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks. We'll
problem.
continue the conversation. Stay
So here?
seated here, and we'll have Phyllis come up and chat about FACT and integration into this system and continue down the path here.
My topic for today is going to be about new models in accreditation and how that fits into some of the things we've been talking about for these new products. Okay, thank you. So FACT, as you know, has a role in cell therapy. Our mission is to improve the quality of cellular therapy through peer-driven standards, accreditation, education, and new efforts in consulting, auditing, and assessment services. I think it's important to just remind ourselves that standards are important in cell therapy. Why do we have standards in accreditation in immune effector cell therapy? These are complex therapies that have been used in the hematopoietic stem cell transplant settings initially. And the experts doing that work found that they appreciated the quality that derived from the infrastructure around quality systems and quality management. These are complex therapy. They are very similar to hematopoietic stem cell transplant, but do have some differences. They do require an infrastructure of a robust quality management system. Physicians are really important to make this happen properly, to get the right product to the right patient, and they're emphasized heavily in the FACT standards and the accreditation process. Another important point is that cell therapy is more than just the product. It involves a donor management, and what we've just been hearing about, scheduling and logistics that add complexity to the manufacturing process. And it's also more than just the infusion. So when talking about cell therapy from a clinical point of view, we're not only talking about receipt of a frozen product that has to be infused, but of all of the logistics of the collection of the starting material, potentially bridging chemotherapy, and then the infusion and long-term follow-up are all important components of quality care. So standards and accreditation can help to expand on existing quality systems, to accommodate new services, new sites, and to new program development and new products in the industry. So in order to be flexible and nimble in this space, FACT publishes 4 sets of standards, as you probably know, and the 2 that we'll pay most attention to are the hematopoietic stem cell transplant standards that cover all things hematopoietic transplant, but also include standards for immune effector cell therapies. We then have our second set of standards, which are the immune effector cell standards. And these are standalone standards intended for programs that are not administering transplant. And I think I wanted to emphasize that at this particular meeting because we've heard some confusion in the world that programs feel they have to be accredited for transplant in order to be accredited for immune effector cell therapies and the CAR T products that are available. And that's not true. We do have standalone accreditation available. This graph on the right shows you the pace and volume of programs that we've accredited over time. And what you see is that in the 8 or 9 years since we started accrediting immune effector cell programs, we have now accredited 171 programs specifically for immune effector cell therapies. And while only one of these is a standalone program, we have several applicants for standalone accreditation currently in line. On the other graph, you see data reported to the CIBMTR for cell therapy over the last several years, and you can see the rapid growth that's happened in these years for the various indications of the products that are commercially available. This does include some clinical trial products also, which speaks to the need to continue to be flexible, look at new models, and increase patient access to therapies. So I'm going to talk about today two initiatives that FACT is engaged in that are interesting, and we hope will have a positive impact on improving patient access. The first is modular accreditation. FACT accreditation has always been flexible, and there are many ways to meet the standards, as we've always said in our educational sessions. There are, in developing modular accreditation, there are a couple of foundational principles of accreditation to keep in mind, and these will remain true even in the advent of modular accreditation. The first is that all FACT standards require a robust quality management plan, and in the diagram you see the elements of what we consider to be a robust program. All standards also require assessment of relevant endpoints and patient outcomes. These outcomes and endpoints are different depending on the stage of the product and the stage of the clinical trial. All standards require compliance with regulatory requirements within any given jurisdiction. And standards are inclusive of clinical trial products and licensed products, and require that there be a comprehensive communication among the elements of the collection, administration, and processing and storage of the products. So it's a comprehensive standard covering the patient from beginning to end of the therapy, and also the product from collection of starting material through disposition. An important concept is that the clinical program is considered the sort of hub of the process, and clinical programs are required by our standards and therefore by our accreditation to use a cell collection facility that meets FACT standards, and also a cell processing facility that meets FACT standards. That being said, the way in which those things are accomplished has always been adaptable to change. Originally, the transplant programs grew out of a single unit where the physicians and scientists were really responsible for all portions: the clinical care, the collection, the marrow harvest, the apheresis when that became a thing, and also product manufacturing and manipulation. Increasing specialization, cell manipulation, cryopreservation techniques, and the involvement of apheresis specialists and apheresis collection facilities led to important collaborations outside of the clinical program and to use of contracted services. It's important that the accredited entity must meet all FACT standards. So in developing our modules, we're looking at a few common principles. As the accredited entity meets all the standards, this can be either by an integrated model or through contracting. Accreditation is not of a service and not of a site, or is of a service. It's not a site, a drug, or a particular individual person. The current modules that we have developed are expansive. We hope that they can increase in the variety and help to improve patient access. This just is a diagram of what the current modules might be. And as you see across the top are the three sorts of clinical programs. There may be a hematopoietic stem cell transplant program, immune effector cell clinical program, or a program administering novel therapies. Across the middle are the modules that would define cell collection, apheresis being probably the most prominent of interest to this audience, but also marrow harvest and the collection of other tissues for further manufacturing into cell therapies. And across the bottom are the potential processing and manufacturing sites that can be accredited. There are maybe a simple laboratory, minimal or more than minimal manipulation, a storage-only facility, or facilities that prepare the cells for administration. So these modules could be put together in a number of different fashions, and what you see on the right is a traditional transplant program with a collection center, a clinical unit, a marrow harvest facility, and a laboratory. In the middle is an example of what a standalone immune effector cell program might look like, but it wouldn't have to look like this, and there could be other elements. This are all shown together, implying that they're all in one unit, but they could also be some of the services by contract. Increasingly, we see things like standalone apheresis centers or standalone collaborative apheresis networks that are seeking accreditation, and standalone laboratories also are part of our accreditation process. In order to acknowledge the contributions of all the people that are involved, especially in apheresis, we have developed a new designation for our apheresis collection, and we'll see that on our website. Centers are now noted to be cellular therapy product collection by apheresis for administration or for further manufacturing. Specifically listing this in the accreditation, we believe will enhance understanding of the ability of these collection centers and demonstrate that they meet FACT standards in their processes and signal to manufacturers that these facilities may be a really important source of starting material for their products. So this is going to be an example of a hub and spoke model of modular accreditation for an apheresis center. We would consider this to be the hub or the main central accredited entity, may or may not be associated with a processing facility. We also know that at the central hub, they may or may not do actual cell collections. It could be more of an administrative hub. We would expect that the central hub is responsible for all things related to accreditation. So in a hub and spoke model, the central accredited entity would be responsible for personnel, facilities, quality management, donor management, and adverse event management, and also the qualification of the distant collection sites where cells might be collected. So there could be any number of distant collection sites, and by distant I mean outside of the four walls of the hub facility. So it could be close, it could all be within one metropolitan area or outside of that area, even in different states across the country. The central hub would be responsible for qualifying these sites as appropriate for the collection of the material. And some of the things they might consider in this qualification effort are things like what kind of donors are being collected there, what are the comorbidities of the donors, are they autologous donors who might need blood transfusion support, do they have comorbidities that would signal to you as an apheresis physician that maybe you want to be closer to a hospital or to an intensive care unit should something go wrong during the collection, or are they normal donors without central venous catheters who could well be managed at a more distant site. So personnel and training and competency would also be important considerations as to what kinds of cells are collected in these sites. There's no requirement that all the sites be equal or that they all do the same thing, but that there be some risk assessment of what kind of products and donors can be managed. One, for example, apheresis site might collect only cells for an IEC transplant program, or IEC therapy program, sorry. And there may be a distant clinical site associated with that. Another site might collect for a transplant program. That program might also use the laboratory of the hub facility or not. And another site might collect for a transplant program Whereas in this case, the apheresis center may choose to actually physically locate the apheresis collection center within the transplant center itself, and still be responsible for the collection aspects. And finally, the apheresis center may collect directly for a manufacturer for products. And it's possible that one of these apheresis sites or more might be in a bus or in a mobile unit. We don't currently have a mobile unit that's accredited, but we've had many inquiries as to could we just put this in a bloodmobile and park it in a lot and collect cells there. And so it's a possibility. I think there would be some considerations there and some risk assessment that might be necessary, but it's possible. So this new model of hub and spoke is going to require some thought about what the accreditation process looks like. This has been discussed, approved, and is being implemented this year, where the process for the accreditation visit will focus on the hub and the responsibilities of the apheresis facility. All collection sites that are included within this entity would be listed and that information provided to FACT. And it would be for any collections that are done for clinical use, for either further manufacturing or direct administration. The on-site inspection would include certainly the central hub and the quality management system around that. It would also include all sites where HPC apheresis products were collected for transplant, and then a portion of the sites where mononuclear cells are collected for further manufacturing, where it might be weighted as to ensure that all variables in the collection process, including transport and shipping, might be included in the inspection. And then all processes related to these distant sites that were not actually physically seen in any one cycle would be assessed at the central hub. So we think this is a model that could increase capacity for collection of starting material and thereby help increase patient access. It's a model that could also be applied to a clinical program where a central facility was responsible for all kinds of clinical care, including the quality management, the personnel, the IRB that might be necessary for out-of-spec products, laboratory testing, support services, data management, and clinical outcomes. But some of the care could be administered in community cancer centers or community clinical sites that met certain specifications and did the different portions of the clinical care as defined by the central accredited program. So that's modular accreditation in a few minutes. The second innovation or initiative that I'd like to just spend a minute about is FACT's solution to the 5-patient conundrum. This has been an effort to remove the barriers to patient access to cellular therapies that are perceived by the standard that requires that you have to have treated 5 patients in order to be accredited. That results in the problem that to get accredited, you have to have done 5 patients, but to do 5 patients, you have to be accredited. The solution that we're proposing and we have available now is a FACT readiness assessment whereby the clinical organization would apply for accreditation and we would assess them as if they were to be accredited. They would be required to meet all of the standards except for the volume. They would then be considered eligible to receive the cell therapy and receive payment for that, which is a big part of barriers that we perceive in cell therapy. And then ultimately they would be able to accumulate 5 patients, treat 5 patients, and apply for full accreditation. This just shows some comparison between what we currently have as our accreditation model and the readiness assessment. And what you see by just looking down the list is that basically the process is the same for the vast majority of events. The accreditation, the readiness assessment process follows the same processes within the same timelines and the same registration and fee assessment as accreditation. The board would approve an entity looking for a readiness assessment. There'd be no minimum number of patients required. I mean, obviously, a lot of SOPs and documents would be available, but no patient records or documentation of implementation would be available yet. I think this is an important effort, and in fact is committed to providing this option to increase access to products and increase patient access. Obviously, however, for this to have any impact, we're going to require some collaboration because the clinical program, to put forth that much effort and go to the expense of becoming ready, will need some assurance that if they do that, the manufacturer will allow access to the product, and the payers will pay for those products while the program is working toward accreditation. So FACT is committed to doing this and offering it as an option to increase patient access. And we're looking to engage with manufacturers, with payers, with clinical sites who are interested in pursuing this model.
I think we talk about a lot of the technological innovation happening at a lot of the suppliers, but we also need continued evolution of the existing infrastructure. And FACT
Right.
pointing to the modular nature and connection is one piece. I think another piece, equal importance, and a little biased with my blood banking connection in my previous career, is BCA and Sam Keith will share some of the next steps for the Blood Centers of America and how this can connect to a lot of the work that FACT is doing. So
Great.
We'll let
Thank
Sam
you, George. Appreciate it.
share a bit. And then
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sam Keith. I'm Senior Vice President of Supply Chain with BCA. Appreciate me being a part of this panel, and I certainly appreciate you joining us this afternoon. I think we're standing in between you. We're standing in the way of you and maybe an early dinner or bar. So it's kind of late in the day, so I appreciate you being in here with us. What I want to do today is I want to go over a little bit about who BCA is, and then I want to talk a little bit about our capabilities and what we've done in advanced therapies, support advanced therapies with our centers. And I'm also going to focus a fair amount on supply chain. So what have we done in supply chain? You heard Bill talk about earlier some of the things that you've experienced and some of the areas that we've covered, and they're all very familiar. But we all learned a lot from the pandemic. BCA was fortunate that we implemented some programs pre-pandemic, and we certainly have implemented some other risk mitigation, supply chain programs, business continuity plans after the pandemic. So I'll touch on some of those. When listening to Bill earlier, I was kind of reminded of some of the areas that we really struggled with during the pandemic, and there was a lot of them. And we coined a phrase a little bit during the pandemic at BCA. It was like, no one cares about supply chain until everybody cares about supply chain. And no truer words could be said, because we got calls from everybody, and it was a lot of long hours. So, but we learned a lot from it. And if you don't learn from it, shame on you. So I'll get started here. Again, I'll touch on who BCA is. So BCA is a network of 60 plus independent community-based blood centers across the country. We've been in business, and we'll be celebrating our 40th anniversary next year. And so one of our primary roles is we do supply chain contracting. So we have right at 150 direct agreements that we've negotiated for our center's behalf that they utilize. And then we also have a relationship with a GPO, nationally recognized GPO, happens to be headquartered here in Dallas, called Vizient or Provista. So we've had a long-standing partnership with them. That gives us access to another portfolio of contracts that we can utilize, that where we don't really want to spend our resources to negotiate the contracts, we can utilize their contracts, increase our, we aggregate our spend, and we're able to negotiate the best terms and pricing. So they're a great partner, but it gives us a full, really portfolio of contracts that we can access. And when you look at our commercialized annual business, it's right at $1 billion. So we have a healthy amount of spend going through all of our contracts, and we've had some long-standing relationships with that. Focusing more on going into the advanced therapies piece, we do have a highly distributed apheresis model, and I've got a map I'll show you here in just a minute. We've got over 400 apheresis machines throughout the country, placed geographically throughout the country. We've got 15 sites for ISO 7 clean rooms. So some of those we don't have maybe a total of 15 right now today. They're either planned or they're in use right now. So, but when I look at this probably a year from now, we'll probably have close to 20. So we've got a lot of plans on the ISO 7 clean rooms in progress, and then the 20 regional cryopreservation sites. So let me show you the map here real quick. This gives us the map of the ISO 7 clean rooms, cell therapy, the cryopreservation sites, and then the MNC apheresis sites as well across the country. And I talked about the 400 apheresis machines. Apheresis machines. There's a mix of two different manufacturers from that. One is Terumo, which is really our more prevalent one, and then there's also Fresenius Kabi that manufactures Amicus. We have both. We're much more heavily weighted on the Terumo. We're kind of looking at that right now to even kind of balance that out, again, as a risk mitigation strategy or business continuity to make sure we don't have too many eggs in one basket, so to speak. I thought this was an important slide to share with you if you're not very familiar with maybe some of the work the BCA centers have done. I thought this was a great stat showing what we've had success with in the blood cell-based therapies, and certainly on the cord blood as well. And some of those therapies you'll probably recognize by name. Building on our national infrastructure. The services that are shown here, those are really what I would consider kind of our core competencies. We do this day in, day out. And so it's a wide range of those. And then you can see the products that are produced from those services. We'll go into a little bit of a supply chain coverage now. Supply chain. This is just a snapshot. I mentioned earlier we've got 150 direct agreements and another portfolio of contracts through the Vizient GPO relationship that we have. This is just a small snapshot of kind of some of the different areas you would expect us to have. I could have filled up this chart with a whole lot of other areas, but this gives you a kind of a good view of what we have and where these are probably where our largest spend areas are as well. So I talked about it earlier. We went through the pandemic, and we had to learn some lessons. Luckily, we had some things in place beforehand. I would say that the pandemic taught us a lot, but there's always going to be supply disruptions. It doesn't matter if it's weather, it doesn't matter if it's embargo strikes, it doesn't matter what it is. There's always going to be some type of supply disruption that we have to be prepared for and expect. And it may not be, hopefully it won't be another pandemic, but from the pandemic, one of the things that we implemented was the third-party logistics, a 3PL distribution model of our medical plastics. That's one of our most critical products that we have for our blood centers. This has been a very, very successful program. And we had to work very closely with our manufacturers, the suppliers of these two products, these two manufacturers, to be able to get them to kind of see our vision and to help us get away from the exposure, the risk that we had, and we can't run out of these products, right? These are our medical plastics, blood bags. We don't have those. We can't collect blood. We've got to have it. So they saw our vision. They understood it. And if you look at this, we've got $25 million of consigned inventory. It means that BCA is not carrying this cost. They are. And that's quite a sum of money. And we've had this for just over about a year and a half now since we implemented this program. It's gone very, very well, but we've got it dispersed, all that inventory with our 3PL partner in 4 distribution locations across the country, meaning I can get the product to any of our centers within 1 or 2 days maximum. It's really important. But again, we don't have carrying costs of all this product. It's sitting there. We have real-time visibility to see this product, what we have on the shelf designated for us. The next one I would say is, we did start to look at reducing some of our sole supplier relationships, and that's really easy to get into. And we had already done some of this before the pandemic, fortunately, And some of it was in a commodity items like exam gloves. That's a really commoditized item. But we had two primary manufacturers before the pandemic. And if anybody remembers during the pandemic, exam gloves were really difficult to get and the price went through the roof. But luckily we had two different primary suppliers. We have about 65-35 split of business. And they both came through very well for us through the pandemic, getting us the gloves. Yep, the pricing went up in some areas, but we could leverage one against the other on the pricing and shift volume. So it worked very well. We still have those same two suppliers today in place, but we've, after the pandemic, we had to start looking at how do we look to replicate the same model because it worked for us and reduce so many sole suppliers. You're not going to get away with it every time. There's just going to be some cases, and in those cases where you have a sole supplier award and you're not going to be able to find another competitive supplier, you're going to need to be really collaborative. And you talked about that earlier, Bill. You talked about the collaboration and working with them, having them see your vision. That's really a big piece of it. I think when you work with a primary supplier like that, where you've got the sole source award, and maybe they've got 95% of your business, they need to understand what your business is, why it's important that they come to. It's about the production forecasting that you can give them and give them the assurances. It's a collaboration. So, those are, and that kind of finishes up my last bullet point there on the supplier preparedness. It's growth through collaboration. They're partners. Yeah, that's an overused term a little bit, but they are partners and you need to treat them as such. And you need to hold them accountable as well, just like they're going to hold you accountable. If you make a volume commitment, you've got to live up to it as well as they do too. And then the next steps here I put, this is something that, I'm here. This is my first time to facilitate, and there's some of my counterparts in supply chain at BCA are here with me. We spent the day going through the exhibit hall, and it was fascinating. There was a lot of companies that I'm not even familiar with, but one of the things that we're doing at BCA, we're going to continue to expand our contract portfolio through many of the companies that were in there today and others, because this is our new frontier for us. This is our new market. This is where we can get a lot of growth for our organization and our centers. And so that's how we're going to be focused on this, just like what we did for the blood industry, blood banking industry. Our portfolio covers 95% of everything they use day in, day out. So we can replicate that same type of model with what we're doing in advanced therapies. I did put this down as far as I think a recommendation or a possible opportunity is looking at a supply chain council for this group, and maybe that's something that can be discussed at a future date. But we've utilized that type of program with other industries. Like an adjacent market that we did a contract with was the American Association of Tissue Banks. They've got 125 OPOs, tissue banks, core banks, eye banks, what have you, in their membership, and they didn't have a GPO program. And so they came to us, we worked with them, we're now their preferred GPO. They utilized a lot of the same contracts we already had in place, and we've built out that portfolio as well. But we did it also with a supply chain council. We had to get feedback from those tissue banks and eye banks because we were unfamiliar with some of those product categories or manufacturer suppliers. So that's a really useful tool that I would kind of like to see us maybe deploy and do this for the advanced therapies market. And then again, the supply chain risk mitigation. We're going to continue to look at ways that we can mitigate the risk within our industry, whether it be utilizing some of the different programs that we've already done in the blood banking piece as well. So I'll finish with that, and I don't know if we're going to take questions right now or.
Yeah, if you want to take a seat, we can.
One question for you, Phyllis, I guess, on this all freight races, the BCA, the footprint that Sam just described, that's hub and scope law, really, I'm super curious to explore that really offline. But do you imagine that this could be an organization as big but non-operational as BCA that could be the hub for all of its centers, or do you think that it's an operational member like Hamlet that has maybe dozens of apheresis sites within its operational business unit?
So I think actually I was thinking about that and he was talking about having all of these apheresis sites. we're talking about a supply, right?
Right.
And could these sites work together to fill if one doesn't have a slot, another one could have a slot? Well, I certainly think something like BCA could be an accredited entity. Our struggle with defining how large an entity could be really is about making sure that there's the proper amount of medical oversight and direct supervision and control over each one of the sites. Because I think whenever you write an SOP or whenever you write a document, it's always implemented slightly differently in every one of your partner sites. And so it does require that there would be some separate accreditations, maybe there would be regional sub-hubs, if you will, but certainly there would be some economies of scale if something like BCA were to become accredited, that each of the sub-hubs would be a smaller effort to document that they were able to maintain compliance. I think the interesting thing would be to shift, it seems like scheduling and logistics for patient access is a real problem at some level, because everything is part of a domino chain. If one thing gets delayed, even so much as somebody needs a transfusion and they can't collect today, so they don't get collected until tomorrow, then they've lost their manufacturing site, or maybe they can't ship that night. So any small thing could make a difference if there were collaboration among apheresis sites to help to meet a clinical need. If there's could be an identified clinical need where several clinical sites would work with an entity that could share. I think that could be, it could ease some of the logistic problem.
Yeah, I think it's good.
And do you see that, Phyllis, as something, there's additional responsibility on the accredited entity, but then further fact connection to their spokes of their hub, or how do you look at that?
So really it does fall to the accredited entity to document all of the things. And I think that's actually been one of our biggest challenges. You mentioned one of the larger blood collection organizations in the country. There are others. And sometimes they've been reluctant to, even when they apply for accreditation, write down all the places where they collect stuff. I've heard them say, well, we have this one machine over here and we only collect 8 a year, but it belongs to so-and-so company who doesn't require accreditation, so we're not going to tell you about that. I think that's okay, it's voluntary accreditation, but I think part of your responsibility, if you're going to be the hub, is to know all those sites and know what goes on at every one of those. And even if it's only 8 a year, it's 8 patients. It's
Right.
8 products, and maybe that site could be 20. So I think that's been part of the challenge, is to make sure that the hub takes responsibility for all of the things that it does. And so you're at the end, what I would envision is at the end of the year, your quality management plan is assessed for its effectiveness. And you would say, yeah, we have 400 machines and we have 40 sites, and this was the productivity at each. This is the risk was assessed. These is the adverse event rate at this site versus that site. It could almost be a comparison amongst them for performance. So it could be a lot of really interesting.
Yeah.
A lot of interesting things could come from it, but somebody has to be responsible for that overall big picture of how many machines do you really own. And are all of your operators really well trained and competent? And are they? I mean, nothing's ever equal in life, but are they equally trained to the extent possible, so
Training
that
standardization,
there's not
yeah.
the patient risk here is no different than here.
It's a great concept, and yeah.
And then, Bill, when you hear, let me tip off this chair. When you hear through this, increased contracting as a manufacturer and developer, that there may be a site that you receive material from that may not be accredited. From a supply chain perspective, how do you look at the contracting entity and the responsibilities between that?
Some of the discussion that happens sometimes is, in some meetings too, is how do we, and I like the hybrid approach, right, from the risk assessment perspective. If we're not saying necessarily at capacity, but we are meeting the needs of the high profile sites that have gotten accredited and have high throughput and have adjacent educational facilities. That, like, how do you continue to broaden your supply base from a patient population perspective? That's going to be understanding and working with your clinical hubs and your clinical teams and fact accreditation to say, this is a risk I'm willing to take, but you need everybody else in the value chain to play along as well. So it's like, we want more. I think everybody wants more patients. Like, and how do we reach them? I think we have the lessons learned from logistics, control we've talked about. We know sustainability of credos and dry shippers and movement and all that technology for temperature monitoring and GPS and orchestration has all come so far. But if the end destination or the beginning destination is, we can get there remotely, right, to deliver the product, but they just don't have the patient population, then you're just automatically cutting them off from access without. I think the risk management approach is really good. So from the new therapy perspective, there were some other, as some of the sites we talked, some of the infusion sites now, maybe they're at capacity and they're not able to take on new INDs or new therapies because they don't have the capability. But there's a site that does have the capability, but they just don't have the patient throughput. How do we have a conglomerate of sites that can maybe come together and manage and together work through that to increase the patient throughput and accessibility?
And how do you reduce the redundancy of multiple site audits and multiple visits so that the site that is busy and full and can't take on any new things doesn't have to do repetitive audits from different companies and duplicate that kind of work. So everything has to get done, but not everybody has to do everything. Yeah. So we can share some of the load of assessments and audits also.
So I'd probably get nervous, but at the same time, I'd probably also say if that's what I need to hit some of my enrollment numbers, I also get worried that I can't hit all my enrollment numbers and my trial is going to take longer than it should. If I can accelerate the timeline for my patient enrollment according to my protocols and I can hit that supply and I have enough of my own internal product to meet that demand that's going to come through, that increased throughput, then I'd say it's probably a risk that I'd want to explore. Right now, it's not necessarily an option.
Yeah. And so standardization
and
accreditation can reduce that risk
and
make it possible to expand your access.
Yeah.
And even, you talk about enrollment numbers. I mean, the big number that we talk about a lot in the CAR-T space, 80% of those eligible are not receiving them. Mm-hmm. We talk about networks, standardization, group purchasing. How do we keep up with the scale of the innovation that we have? And what can we all do to work together on that front?
Right, because no one of us can solve it. No one of us can probably even list what all the barriers are. So it definitely takes a collaboration.
And I think one thing evident from all the conversation, not all collection centers, clinical centers, others are alike. We tend to break it into large academic medical centers and community, but I think we need to break it down even further around capabilities, responsibilities, and so on. And curious to see, from the therapeutic side, how you look at that. And then from the fact side and BCA, how do you meet the clinical program where it is, but more importantly, in the service of meeting the patients where they are, both in the journey and in geographic.
Yeah, I think across different modalities, right? Autologous cell therapy is one way to do that, but we also have different disease indications that are not hematological cancers. So it's like, is it different patient populations that go? I think you walk around the show there, and there is just so much technology. Decentralized is one way. I think that's a very big challenge, but automation, streamline. It can be, hopefully reduce cost of goods, so that way you do have maybe some opportunities to then, get to those markets. But decentralized, I know there's a couple places that are trying to do that. It's also very, very, It's and then.
I think that's one of the beauty of being on the patient side. Many of these sessions are autologous versus allogeneic, centralized versus decentralized, and the answer is all of them right now.
All of them. Yeah, it's 6 months ago.
Simultaneously, and there is no winning except for treating 100% of the eligible patients. We can solve some of that here, but as I've learned in my journey around the payment, payer, reimbursement side, we might be harder than gene editing. We can figure that out, no doubt, on the science. But we do need to figure out the regulatory environment and the payer environment.
Right.
And how do we collaborate to better educate, keep up? I know I was shocked early in the allogeneic cell therapy world that nobody at the FDA knew donor qualification for allogeneic therapy. But how could they? It had never really been done in a CAR T before. Misplaced anger in my youth, but so much to
But
learn.
still, they're the ones that wrote the rules, right? So how come they don't understand that is, a little hard to understand. Because allogeneic donor eligibility ought to be the same, whether it's transplant or further manufacturing. It's at least got the same concept behind it, even if there are some details that might vary.
Yeah, I think there were some things, we learned early we had to take from what we knew, but there are some parts of allogeneic therapy that the blood banking world around a healthy donor and CAR T specifically, we need to look at a bit differently. So
Right, it's
how
a
do you
little- it's a
start
little
with,
different.
how do you start with what's there and then grow? It's not just from the allogeneic side, but every connection to the patient collection side.